Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, a city of nearly 1 million people, is a leading capital of the world today. The city of Washington reflects closely the life, spirit, and character of the American nation. It's a vigorously expanding city, a land of friendly people. The marble statue of Lincoln brings back to many an American lively memories of the past. And on this morning of the 22nd of July 1964, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tunku Abdul Rahman, comes to the White House as an invited guest of the American President. On his arrival at White House, the Tunku was greeted by President Johnson and wife and by top officials and dignitaries. Present also to meet him were members of our Malaysian embassy staff. The Tunku was given a rousing welcome and was accorded full military honours and a 19-gun salute. The Tunku was warmly welcomed by President Johnson, who expressed the great admiration the people of America have for his undying courage, outstanding leadership, and for his devotion to peace. In his reply, the Tunku paid tribute to President Johnson for his work in the cause of freedom, democracy, and peace. The Tunku added that, to small nations, America forever stands as a pillar of hope and a guarantor of their rights as free nations. President Johnson and Tunku then proceeded into White House for further discussions. President Johnson pledged the support of the United States for Malaysia and agreed to provide military training and equipment. At a press conference in Blair House, he drew their attention to the dangers of Indonesian confrontation. He pointed out that Malaysia, like America, is a democratic nation that is equally against communism. The Tunku then went on to say, there was no doubt that the vast majority of Americans have deep sympathy for Malaysia in its controversy with Indonesia and in the nation's push towards economic well-being. Later in the day, the Tunku leaves for the TV National Broadcasting Company. At a TV interview, the Tunku said that his talks with President Johnson in Washington gave him much encouragement in our present trouble. Decrying Indonesia's policy of confrontation of Malaysia, he said, "We ourselves want to do nothing more than to live in peace and progress and have good and friendly relations with all our neighbors." At the cemetery of the unknown soldier, the Tunku pays his respects at the tomb. The Tunku and his party later visited the tomb of the late President Kennedy, the great statesman who had been a very close and dear friend of his. At the luncheon given by the members of the National Press Club, the Prime Minister was given a standing ovation. The Tunku, who had come to enlighten the free world to the dangers of Indonesian confrontation, pointed out that Indonesia's declared policy of hostile aggression against Malaysia would threaten the peace of the whole of Asia. The Tunku said, "There are so many signs of real trouble in Southeast Asia that it's difficult to decide whether we are living there in Cold War or hot peace." At the Malaysian ambassador's residence, there is a friendly exchange of gifts. The Tunku presents President Johnson a walking stick, and to Mrs. Johnson, he presents a gorgeous homespun kain songket. The Tunku, in return, receives an autographed picture of the President. At the Islamic Center in Washington is the serenely beautiful Washington Mosque. The Tunku, on his arrival at the mosque, was presented with the Holy Quran. Among the large crowd who attended the usual prayers at the Washington Mosque was the Malaysian ambassador to America, Dato' Ong Yok Lin. Fort Bragg is a special warfare center in North Carolina where techniques of unconventional warfare are taught. Some of our Malaysian non-commissioned officers are to be sent here to learn the techniques that the Americans have adopted and improved from their experience during the communist wars in Malaysia and largely from their experiences in Vietnam. This is a tough breeding ground for soldiers in the techniques of what is termed as tropical country guerrilla warfare. Its facilities are available to governments who request them as part of the American aid program. The American government has not only assured us aid in the training of our military personnel, but also promised military support in the form of providing Malaysia with suitable equipment. At the John F. Kennedy Space Center, the Tunku and his party inspected and saw demonstrations of United States space progress. The Tunku was shown a model of the United States Ranger 7 satellite, which sent back to Earth some 4,000 historic close-up photographs of the Moon. Space scientists have tentatively concluded that the pictures indicate that the lunar surface is suitable for landings by man. He also inspected a model of a Saturn I rocket, which was being prepared for a September launching. The Prime Minister and his party were thoroughly impressed by the demonstrations. On the evening of the 27th of July, the Tunku and his party leave Greaves Air Force Base for Ottawa, the beautiful capital of Canada. It has a population of over 250,000, about half of whom are French-speaking and the other half English-speaking. The Tunku, accompanied by Ambassador Dato' Ong Yok Lin and by the Minister of Information and Broadcasting Encik Sinu bin Abdul Rahman, arrived at Uplands Airport, where they were met by the Canadian Prime Minister Mr. Pearson, the Secretary of State for External Affairs, and the Commonwealth High Commissioners and the Diplomatic Corps. Present also to meet him were some of our Malaysian students studying in Canada under the Colombo Plan. Canada's Prime Minister Mr. Lester Pearson, in his welcoming address, reaffirmed Canada's support for Malaysia. He complimented the Tunku and people of Malaysia for their efforts to maintain peace and unity. In reply to the Canadian Premier's welcoming speech, the Tunku said there were many matters of common interest and concern to discuss with Prime Minister Pearson. He was happy to visit once more the Canadian people for whom he had the greatest admiration. Following the warm welcoming ceremony, the Malaysian Prime Minister calls at the office of Mr. Pearson in the Parliament building. The Tunku laid before the Canadian Premier suggestions whereby Canada could help Malaysia in its dispute with Indonesia. He received the assurance of Prime Minister Pearson that Canada would be sympathetic in its response to granting assistance to Malaysia. At the garden party at the British High Commissioner's residence, the Tunku was welcomed by the High Commissioner, Mr. Earnscliffe. Present also at this gathering was his old friend, the former Prime Minister, Mr. Diefenbaker, with whom he exchanged a few friendly words. At the Canadian plant for airplanes, the Tunku and his party were taken on a conducted tour of the Canadian plant, where they viewed the demonstration of a CL-41 jet trainer. The Tunku was thoroughly impressed by the efficient performance of the jet. Canada has offered special arrangements for Malaysia to purchase Canadian aircrafts as part of its assistance towards Malaysia's struggle against Indonesia. During his brief visit to Montreal, the Tunku met Malaysian students. The Tunku was able to announce that the Canadian government had agreed to give Malaysia practical assistance in warding off Indonesian aggression, and that he is grateful to the Canadian government and people for their support. After his 3-day visit to Canada, the Tunku flew back to New York City. New York is an extravagant city of towering skyscrapers and a city of friendly people. At a surprise ceremony at Hotel Plaza, the Tunku was awarded the Medallion of New York City by Deputy Mayor. Glowing tributes were paid to his leadership in Southeast Asia. Few heads of foreign governments visiting the metropolis have won the hearts of New Yorkers as the Tunku has done. While in New York, the Tunku and his party had the good fortune of viewing the New York World Fair. Each pavilion is presented in a setting typical of its own land. The many nations have formed together to focus attention in their achievements, past and present, and some offer a peep into the future. The Malaysian Pavilion, which has been one of the attractions of the fair for this 1964 season, was seen for the first time by thousands of Americans. Here we see a gorgeous display of our elaborately spun kain songket and the intricately designed silverware articles of the famous east coast of Malaysia. Although Malaysia is a new nation, she has a magnificent record of achievement, and the world has to be told about this progress. Bearing the theme, Peace Through Understanding, the colossal exposition will feature the latest and greatest wonders from the world of science, industry, communication, and culture from 37 nations and scores of American states. Indeed, it has everything. A unisphere shoots beams of light against a backdrop of dancing waters. It's a special spectacle for the young and old, a tribute and a monument to man's ceaseless search for greater glory. And this lively and extravagant city of New York is an impressive symbol of the continuous growth of man's restless search for greater and greater glory. The heart of New York, in the early evening with thousands of lighted windows producing the magic effect, is indeed a fairyland of delight. Later that night, the Tunku was guest of honor at a feast given by the Malaysian Students Association of New York. The Tunku assured the students that he was confident that everything would be all right and told them not to pay too much attention to the troubles at home. The United Nations, since its establishment, has been the center for harmonizing the actions of its member nations towards the establishment of peace. The United Nations is the one meeting place where the representatives of 81 nations, the great and the small, the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, spokesmen for all political views, social systems, cultures and religions are freely heard. The Tunku and his party paid a courtesy call to the Secretary General of the United Nations, U Thant. They had a brief discussion on world affairs in general. In his meeting in New York with the United Nations representative of Afro-Asian countries, the Tunku speech aroused widespread interest and increased understanding and appreciation of Malaysia's stand against Indonesia. The Tunku stated that Malaysia would establish diplomatic posts in the Afro-Asian countries as soon as money and manpower allowed. The Tunku's mission to the United States and to Canada, apart from assuring a promise of aid, has helped to bring the Malaysia case before the world. When Tunku Abdul Rahman returns home, he'll be able to look back on a brilliantly successful mission overseas.